The abandoned cabin sat like a forgotten prayer in the Montana wilderness, its windows boarded shut against 20 years of brutal winters. Chen pressed her gloved hand against her swollen belly as snow crunched beneath her boots. 6 months pregnant, betrayed by the man she trusted with her heart and her architectural firm, she had nowhere left to run except to this frozen relic her grandmother had left her. Inside, the temperature barely rose above freezing, but Maya had survived worse than cold. She'd survived having everything stolen from her. What she hadn't expected was the trunk hidden beneath rotting floorboards filled with love letters, baby clothes, and photographs of a couple who looked exactly like her and her ex-fiancé. The dates on the letters made her blood run cold. Someone had lived this exact nightmare 50 years ago in this very cabin. But unlike Maya, this woman hadn't been abandoned. She'd been loved, protected, and cherished through it all. As Maya read deeper into the mysterious correspondence, she realized these weren't just love letters. They were a roadmap to healing, and possibly to a family connection she never knew existed. But who were these people, and why did their story mirror hers so perfectly? The cabin door groaned on rusted hinges as Maya shouldered it open, sending a cascade of ice crystals dancing through the dim interior. Her breath formed white clouds in the stagnant air, and she could feel the cold seeping through her worn boots. 3 days ago, she'd been living in a downtown Seattle penthouse, planning her wedding to David Chen. No relation, despite the shared surname that had sparked their first conversation at an architecture conference. Now she owned nothing but the clothes on her back and this mysterious inheritance. David's betrayal had been surgical in its precision. While she'd been choosing baby cribs and nursery colors, he'd been systematically transferring their joint business assets to offshore accounts. The engagement ring that had once symbolized their future now sat in a pawn shop, barely covering her bus ticket to Montana and enough supplies to last a week. Maya set her single duffel bag on the dusty wooden table and surveyed her new reality. Cobwebs draped the corners like tattered curtains, and mouse droppings peppered the floor. The stone fireplace held nothing but ash and debris, but at least the structure seemed sound. Her architectural eye automatically assessed the bones of the building: solid log construction, good foundation, salvageable with enough work and money she didn't have. Her grandmother had mentioned this place only once, during Maya's childhood. A refuge, she'd called it, somewhere the women of their family could go when the world became too much to bear. Maya had inherited it 5 years ago, but had never visited, too busy building her career and her life with David to care about some remote cabin in the wilderness. The floorboard gave way beneath her feet with a sharp crack, sending her stumbling backward. As she regained her balance, she noticed the board hadn't just broken. It had been deliberately cut, creating a hidden compartment beneath. Her fingers found the edges, and with effort, she pried up a section to reveal a metal trunk wrapped in oilcloth. Inside the trunk lay treasures that made no sense: dozens of letters tied with blue ribbon, their envelopes yellowed with age, baby clothes in soft pastels, carefully folded and preserved, and photographs, black and white images that made her heart stutter. A young Asian woman with Maya's exact features stood beside a tall, blonde man who could have been David's twin. The woman wore a simple wedding dress, her hand resting on a pregnant belly identical to Maya's. Maya's hands trembled as she lifted the first letter. The envelope bore her grandmother's maiden name, Eleanor Kim, and a date from 1973. The return address read, J. Morrison, Mountain View Ranch, Whitefish, Montana. My dearest Ellie. The letter began in strong, masculine handwriting. The snow has been falling for 3 days straight, but I don't mind. It means I can keep you warm by the fire and feel our little one dancing beneath my hands. You asked me yesterday if I'm certain about us, about raising a mixed-race child in this place where people stare. Let me be clear. I would move mountains before I let anyone hurt you or our baby. Maya sank onto the dusty floor, her heart pounding. This was her grandmother's story, but it was also somehow her own. The parallels were impossible to ignore. The pregnancy, the isolation, even the physical resemblance between the couples. But where Maya had been abandoned and betrayed, Eleanor had been cherished and protected. She reached for another letter, then another, each one revealing more pieces of a love story that had unfolded in this very cabin. As afternoon light filtered through the gaps in the boarded windows, Maya lost herself in her grandmother's world, searching for answers to questions she hadn't known she needed to ask. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's weathered walls and reminding Maya that night was coming. But for the first time in days, she didn't feel entirely alone. The rusty key turned easier than expected, and the cabin door swung open with a prolonged creak that echoed through the surrounding pines. Sarah stepped inside, her hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly as she surveyed what would become her temporary sanctuary. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through grimy windows, illuminating a space frozen in time. The cabin was larger than it appeared from outside, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a small kitchenette tucked into the corner. Mismatched furniture, a faded floral couch, a wooden rocking chair, a dining table scarred with years of use, suggested someone had once called this place home. Sarah set her single suitcase down and walked to the nearest window, wiping away grime with her sleeve. The view beyond took her breath away. Rolling mountains stretched endlessly, their peaks touched with early autumn gold. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than despair. Perhaps it was hope, or maybe just exhaustion wearing thin enough to let other emotions seep through. The kitchen cabinets yielded basic supplies, mismatched dishes, a few dented pots, and surprisingly, several cans of soup and beans with expiration dates still months away. Someone had stocked this place recently, though dust suggested no one had visited in weeks. Sarah made a mental note to ask Mrs. Chen about it when she returned the spare key. As she explored further, opening doors and testing light switches, the cabin revealed its secrets slowly. The bedroom contained a double bed with a patchwork quilt that looked handmade, its intricate pattern speaking of patient hands and long winter evenings. A small dresser stood against the wall, and when Sarah pulled open the top drawer to check for linens, her fingers encountered something unexpected. A bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. She hesitated, her conscience warring with curiosity. These weren't hers to read, but the cabin felt so isolated, so forgotten, that perhaps their owner would never return to claim them. After a moment's hesitation, she lifted the bundle out and carried it to the rocking chair by the window. The letters were addressed to someone named Elena, written in a masculine hand that spoke of education and care. The return address bore the name James Morrison, with a post office box in Denver. The postmark spanned nearly 2 years, from spring to winter, and then stopped abruptly. Sarah untied the ribbon with trembling fingers, selecting a letter from the middle of the stack. As she unfolded the yellowed paper, she felt like an intruder, but something compelled her to continue. "My dearest Elena," the letter began, "the mountains seem different without your laughter echoing through them. I know we agreed that distance would help us think clearly, but every sunrise reminds me of the morning we watched the world wake up from your cabin window. I've made mistakes, more than any man deserves forgiveness for, but I cannot stop believing that what we had was worth fighting for." Sarah's breath caught. This was Elena's cabin. She was sitting in Elena's chair, reading Elena's love letters from a man who clearly adored her. The intimacy of it made her feel both guilty and oddly comforted. Here was proof that love existed, even if it seemed impossibly distant from her own life. She read on, learning that James had left Elena, though the reasons remained unclear from this single letter. He wrote of regret, of nights spent staring at city lights and wishing they were stars above the mountain cabin. He begged for another chance, promised he had changed, that he finally understood what mattered. The baby kicked, startling Sarah from the letter. She pressed her hand to her belly, wondering what her child's father was doing at this moment. Unlike James Morrison, Derek hadn't written letters begging forgiveness. He'd simply moved his pregnant secretary into the house that should have been Sarah's, changing the locks and having his lawyer deliver papers that dissolved their relationship as efficiently as a business transaction. Sarah folded the letter carefully and retied the ribbon. Elena's story would wait. Right now, she needed to focus on making this place livable before dark. But as she stood to continue her exploration of the cabin, she found herself wondering about Elena. Had she forgiven James? Had he ever made it back to the mountains? And why had these letters been left behind? The cabin's silence seemed to hold secrets, and for the first time since her world collapsed, Sarah felt a flicker of something beyond her own pain. Here was a mystery, a story of love and loss that predated her arrival. Perhaps, in learning about Elena and James, she might find some understanding of her own journey. As the sun began to sink behind the mountains, painting the cabin walls golden, Sarah realized she was no longer thinking about Derek's betrayal. Instead, she was wondering about the woman who had once sat in this same chair, reading letters from a man who loved her desperately enough to write through 2 seasons of silence. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the world outside draped in mist that clung to the pine trees like gossamer veils. Sarah woke on the dusty couch with a crick in her neck and the baby doing somersaults against her ribs. Pale sunlight filtered through grimy windows, revealing details she'd missed in yesterday's dim light. The cabin was larger than she'd initially thought, with a small kitchen tucked behind the main room and what appeared to be 2 bedrooms down a narrow hallway. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, as if the place had been holding its breath, waiting. Her stomach growled loudly enough to echo in the silence. The granola bars from her purse would have to suffice for breakfast, but first she needed to explore her temporary sanctuary more thoroughly. In daylight, she could see that someone had loved this place once. Hand-carved details adorned the window frames, and built-in shelves lined one wall, still filled with books whose spines had faded to gentle pastels. Sarah approached the bookshelves with curiosity, running her finger along the volumes. Poetry collections, classic novels, and what appeared to be several journals bound in worn leather. She pulled one of the journals free, surprised by its weight. The cover was soft with age, and when she opened it, elegant handwriting flowed across cream-colored pages. May 15th, 1987. The lilacs are blooming outside our bedroom window, and their scent fills the whole cabin each morning. James says I'm being sentimental again, but I've pressed some of the flowers between these pages anyway. Someday, when we're old and grey, I want to remember exactly how this happiness feels. Sarah's breath caught. These weren't just random belongings left behind by careless renters. This was someone's life, someone's love story, preserved in intimate detail. She flipped through several more entries, each one revealing glimpses of a relationship that seemed almost too perfect to be real. June 3rd, 1987. James surprised me with breakfast in bed this morning. Burnt toast and coffee so strong it could wake the dead, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. He's been working such long hours at the mill, but he still finds ways to make me feel like the most important thing in his world. The writing continued for months, documenting a love that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Sarah found herself sinking into the rocking chair by the window, completely absorbed. The woman's name was Elena, and her joy practically radiated from every page. But as Sarah continued reading, she noticed subtle changes in the tone. The entries became less frequent, and when Elena did write, there were hints of something troubling beneath the surface. October 12th, 1987. James came home angry again today. The mill is talking about layoffs, and I can see the worry eating at him. He won't talk about it, just sits on the porch smoking one cigarette after another. I try to tell him we'll figure it out together, but he looks at me like I couldn't possibly understand. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly. She understood that look, had seen it in David's eyes during those final weeks when everything fell apart. The way men seem to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders, shutting out the very people who wanted to help them bear it. November 8th, 1987. Found an empty whiskey bottle hidden behind the woodshed. When I asked James about it, he exploded, said I was checking up on him like he was a child. The cabin feels so small when he's angry, like the walls are closing in. I keep thinking if I just love him enough, If I just try harder, things will go back to how they were. The parallels to her own situation were becoming uncomfortable. Sarah closed the journal and set it aside, but her eyes were drawn to a framed photograph on the nearby end table. A young couple stood in front of the very cabin where she now sat. The woman had dark hair and kind eyes, while the man's arm was wrapped protectively around her waist. They looked so happy, so certain of their future together. Sarah picked up the frame, studying their faces. Elena appeared to be about her own age, with that radiant glow that came from being completely, utterly in love. But knowing what she'd read in the journal, seeing the cracks that were already forming beneath that perfect surface, made the photograph feel almost heartbreaking. A sudden creak from somewhere in the cabin made her freeze. The sound came again, definitely footsteps on the front porch. Sarah's pulse quickened as she set down the photograph and moved quietly to the window. Through the grimy glass, she could see a figure approaching the door. An elderly man with silver hair and worn work clothes stood on the porch, a large bag slung over his shoulder. He moved with the familiarity of someone who'd been here many times before, and as he reached for the door handle, Sarah realized she was about to discover that this abandoned cabin wasn't quite as abandoned as she'd believed. The morning light filtered through the cracked windows, casting dancing shadows across the dusty floorboards as Emma made her way to the kitchen. Her back ached from sleeping on the old couch, but it was still better than the alternatives she'd faced 3 days ago. The baby had been particularly active during the night, as if responding to the mountain air and the strange sense of peace this place offered, despite its obvious neglect. She'd found instant coffee in one of the cabinets, along with some canned goods that were still within their expiration dates. Whoever had left this place hadn't planned to be gone forever, or at least hadn't expected to be gone this long. The thought made her stomach twist with guilt, but she pushed it aside. She'd figure out how to make this right once she got back on her feet. While waiting for the water to heat on the ancient gas stove, Emma found herself drawn again to the wooden box she'd discovered the night before. In the morning light, she could see it more clearly, hand-carved with intricate roses along the edges, the wood worn smooth by countless touches. Her fingers traced the delicate pattern as she lifted the lid. The photographs were even more striking in daylight. The woman had dark hair like Emma's own, though styled in the fashion of decades past. Her smile was radiant, unguarded, the kind of expression Emma remembered having once before Marcus had slowly chipped away at her confidence with his careful criticisms and casual cruelties. Beneath the photos lay letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Emma hesitated only a moment before untying the bundle. The paper was yellowed but still sturdy, covered in masculine handwriting that slanted decisively across the page. "My dearest Catherine," the first letter began, "dated 40 years ago. I know you think I'm crazy for buying this old place, but when I stand on the porch and look out at those mountains, I can see our future. I can see us growing old together here, watching sunsets from that creaky swing, maybe teaching our children to fish in the stream that runs behind the property." Emma's breath caught. Children. She placed a protective hand over her belly, feeling an unexpected kinship with this Catherine, whoever she was. She read on, learning fragments of a love story that had unfolded in this very cabin. There were letters about renovation plans, about quiet evenings by the fireplace, about dreams of the family they'd build together. The man's name was Thomas, and his words painted pictures of a love so deep and certain that Emma felt a sharp pang of loss for something she'd never truly had. The later letters grew more complicated. References to arguments, to misunderstandings, to time spent apart. "I know you need space to think," one read. "I'll wait as long as it takes. This cabin will always be here, just like my love for you. Whatever's broken between us, we can fix it." But the final letter, written in shakier handwriting, told a different story. "The doctors say I don't have much time left. I keep hoping you'll come back before it's too late. I've left everything to you, the cabin, all of it. Maybe someday you'll be ready to remember the good times we had here." Emma's eyes blurred as she set the letter down. She looked around the cabin with new understanding. This wasn't just an abandoned place, it was a monument to love lost, to chances that had slipped away. Thomas had died waiting for Catherine to come home. The kettle's whistle startled her back to the present. As she prepared her coffee, Emma noticed something she'd missed the night before. Propped against the window above the sink was a small framed photo of the cabin itself, but from years earlier when it had been pristine and welcoming. Flower boxes had adorned the windows, and the porch had been painted a cheerful yellow. Wind chimes had hung from the eaves, and the yard had been carefully tended. Someone had loved this place deeply, had poured their heart into making it a home. The neglect wasn't from lack of caring, it was from absence, from a love story interrupted and never resumed. Emma carried her coffee to the window and looked out at the overgrown garden where she could now make out the remnants of careful planning. Rose bushes struggled beneath a tangle of weeds. A stone pathway, barely visible, led to what might once have been a vegetable garden. Her hand moved to her belly again as she felt the baby shift and settle. She thought about Thomas's dreams of teaching children to fish, of growing old with someone who loved this mountain refuge as much as he had. She thought about Catherine, who had stayed away too long and lost her chance for reconciliation. Most of all, she thought about second chances, and whether it was possible to honor someone else's dreams while building your own. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the kitchen and filling it with golden light that made everything seem possible. The morning light filtered through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the cabin floor as Maya carefully lifted the photograph from the trunk. Her hands trembled slightly, whether from the cold or anticipation she couldn't tell. The image showed a young woman with dark hair twisted into victory rolls, her smile radiant despite the photograph's sepia tones. She wore a simple dress with pearl buttons, and her eyes held a spark of mischief that seemed to leap from the decades-old paper. On the back, in fading ink, someone had written Eleanor, summer 1943. Maya sank onto the dusty floor, cradling the photograph. Eleanor. Finally, a name to attach to the mystery that had consumed her thoughts since discovering the trunk. She reached for more items, her movements reverent, as if handling sacred relics. Beneath layers of tissue paper, she found a string of pearls, real ones from the weight of them, and a small velvet box containing a simple gold wedding band. The next photograph made her breath catch. Eleanor stood beside a tall man in military uniform, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. Even in the formal pose typical of the era, their love was palpable. The man's eyes never left Eleanor's face, as if she were the only thing in his world worth looking at. On the back, Eleanor and James, wedding day, September 1943. Maya's throat tightened. She recognized that look, remembered feeling treasured in exactly that way. Before everything fell apart, before David's lies and betrayal stripped away her faith in love's permanence. More letters emerged from the trunk, tied with the same faded ribbon. These were different from the passionate exchanges she'd read yesterday. James's handwriting appeared rushed, desperate. "My darling Eleanor, I cannot tell you where we're going, only that I may not be able to write for some time. Keep our light burning in the window. I'll find my way home to you and our little one." Maya's hand moved instinctively to her still flat stomach. Eleanor had been pregnant too, waiting alone while her husband fought a war half a world away. The parallel felt too sharp, too personal. She unfolded another letter, this one from Eleanor to James, though whether it had ever been sent was unclear. "I feel you with me every morning when the sun touches our mountain. The baby grows strong. I'm certain it's a girl, and she kicks whenever I play our song on the radio. Mrs. Henderson from town brought supplies last week and says I'm foolish to stay up here alone, but this cabin holds you, James. Every board you hammered, every window you hung, you're here with us." Maya looked around the cabin with new eyes. James had built this place, crafted it with his own hands for the woman he loved. The uneven floorboards, the slightly crooked doorframe, they weren't signs of amateur construction but tokens of devotion, a sanctuary created in whatever spare moments a young man could steal before war called him away. Thunder rumbled outside, and Maya realized the morning had surrendered to an overcast afternoon. She'd been lost in Eleanor's world for hours, but she couldn't stop now. Each letter, each photograph pulled her deeper into a love story that felt more real than her own life. A small bundle wrapped in blue tissue paper contained baby clothes, tiny gowns with hand-embroidered flowers, knitted booties no bigger than Maya's thumb. Eleanor had prepared for her child with such hope, such careful attention to every detail. Maya held up a christening gown, its yellowed lace still delicate despite the decades, and imagined Eleanor stitching by candlelight, dreaming of the day she'd dress her baby in this precious garment. At the bottom of the trunk, Maya discovered a leather journal, its cover worn smooth by countless touches. Eleanor's diary. Maya hesitated. Letters were one thing, but a diary felt like crossing a sacred boundary. Yet Eleanor was long gone, and these secrets had waited decades to be discovered. Perhaps they needed to be known. The first entry was dated October 1943. James has been gone 6 weeks. The silence is harder than his leaving. I talk to our daughter constantly. Yes, I'm more certain each day she's a girl, telling her about her father's laugh, his gentle hands, the way he hums while he works. She must know him, even if... The entry ended abruptly, as if Eleanor couldn't bear to finish the thought. Maya turned the page, hungry for more, but rain began drumming against the windows with increasing intensity. The storm she'd seen building all morning had finally arrived, and with it came a chill that seeped through the cabin's walls. She reluctantly closed the diary and gathered the scattered photographs and letters. As she carefully returned Eleanor's treasures to their tissue paper nests, Maya caught sight of her reflection in the trunk's tarnished mirror lining. For a moment, she saw Eleanor looking back, another young woman, alone and pregnant, taking refuge in this mountain sanctuary. The connection felt profound, as if Eleanor had left these memories not just as relics of the past, but as a message for whoever needed to find them. Outside, the storm intensified, but Maya felt oddly comforted. She wasn't the first woman to seek shelter here, and somehow that made all the difference. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor as Sarah sat cross-legged beside the trunk, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for another bundle of letters. Sleep had eluded her most of the night, her mind spinning with questions about Margaret and the mysterious love story that seemed to permeate every corner of this forgotten cabin. The letter she unfolded was different from the others. The paper was newer, the ink less faded. Her breath caught as she read the date, just 3 years ago. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "I know you said not to write anymore, but I can't stop hoping. The doctors say I don't have much time left, and there are things I need you to know, things I should have said 40 years ago." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. 40 years. She calculated quickly. That would put the beginning of their story sometime in the early 1980s. Her fingers moved carefully along the aged paper as she continued reading. "I never stopped loving you, not for a single day. I know you think I chose my family's expectations over you, but you have to understand, when my father threatened to destroy your teaching career, to make sure you'd never work in education again anywhere in the state, I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I married Catherine, if I gave him what he wanted, he'd leave you alone." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. The pain in those words was raw, immediate, as if the writer had poured his very soul onto the page. "I was young and stupid and scared. I didn't realize that losing me would hurt you more than losing your job ever could. By the time I understood that, you'd already disappeared from town. I spent years looking for you, hiring investigators, following every lead. When I finally found you here in these mountains, you were so angry, so hurt. You said you never wanted to see me again." The baby stirred within her, and Sarah placed a protective hand over her belly, wondering what it would feel like to love someone so completely that decades of separation couldn't diminish it. "But I kept coming back, didn't I? Once a month for 15 years. Hiking up that old trail, leaving flowers on your porch until you finally agreed to let me in for coffee. Do you remember that first afternoon we talked? You were so guarded, so careful not to let me see how much you'd missed me too. But I saw it anyway, in the way your hands shook when you poured the coffee, in how you couldn't quite meet my eyes. Sarah glanced around the cabin with new understanding. Those careful touches she'd noticed, the feminine curtains, the masculine coffee mug, the two chairs positioned to face each other by the fireplace. They told the story of two people learning to love each other again, carefully, cautiously, after decades of heartbreak. A sound outside made her freeze. Footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. Her pulse quickened as she remembered her isolation, how far she was from any help. The steps paused at the door, and she held her breath, the letter still clutched in her hands. 3 soft knocks echoed through the silence. "Margaret!" The voice was male, elderly, rough with emotion and what sounded like illness. I know you can't answer, but I brought your favorite flowers anyway. The purple ones from down by Miller's Creek." Sarah remained perfectly still, afraid even to breathe. Through the thin wall she could hear him moving around on the porch, the soft scrape of something being set down. "I miss you so much," the voice continued, barely above a whisper. 3 months, and it still doesn't feel real. I keep expecting to see you at the window, shaking your head at this old fool who can't seem to stay away. Understanding crashed over Sarah like a wave. Margaret was dead. This man, the letter writer, didn't know someone else was living here now. She looked down at the letter in her hands with a mixture of awe and heartbreak, realizing she was holding the remnants of a love story that had only recently ended. "I brought something else," he said, and she heard the rustle of paper. Another letter. "I know you can't read it, but I needed to write it anyway. I'm going to leave it with the others in case somehow you can still hear me." The footsteps moved away from the door, around toward the side of the cabin. Sarah crept to the window and peered out carefully. She could see him now, a tall, thin man with white hair, probably in his 70s, walking slowly toward the back of the property. He wore a heavy coat despite the mild weather, and something in his careful movements suggested fragility, illness. When she was certain he'd gone, Sarah ventured onto the porch. A small bouquet of wild purple flowers lay beside the door, and underneath it, a fresh envelope with Margaret, written in shaky handwriting across the front. The morning light filtered through the dusty cabin windows as Maya carefully arranged the letters in chronological order on the wooden table. She'd spent the previous evening reading through them again, and now the timeline of Eleanor and Thomas's relationship spread before her like pieces of a puzzle finally taking shape. The earliest letters dated back to 1962, when Eleanor was barely 18 and Thomas was home on leave from the army. Their correspondence painted a picture of young love, interrupted by duty and distance, but strengthened by unwavering devotion. Maya traced her finger along the faded ink of one particular passage where Thomas wrote about wanting to build Eleanor a house in the mountains, somewhere they could watch the sunrise together every morning. A sudden knock at the cabin door made Maya's heart skip. She quickly gathered the letters, protective instincts flaring as she wondered who could have found her here. Through the window, she glimpsed a woman in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a wool coat, despite the warming spring weather. Maya opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain latch engaged. "Can I help you?" The woman's eyes, a startling shade of blue, studied Maya with curious intensity. "I'm sorry to disturb you, dear. I'm Helen Garrett from down the mountain. I was driving by yesterday and noticed smoke from the chimney. This place has been empty for so long, I wanted to make sure everything was all right." Something about the woman's gentle manner eased Maya's tension. She unlatched the chain and opened the door wider. "I'm Maya. I've been staying here temporarily. I hope that's okay. I didn't think anyone would mind." Helen's expression softened with understanding rather than judgment. "May I come in? I knew the people who used to live here, seeing someone here again after all these years." She trailed off, emotion flickering across her weathered features. Maya stepped aside, suddenly eager for answers. "Please come in. Would you like some tea? I was just looking through some things I found here." As Helen entered, her gaze swept over the cabin with obvious familiarity. She paused at the table where Maya had hastily stacked the letters, her hand rising unconsciously to her throat. "Oh my, you found Eleanor's letters. You knew Eleanor?" Maya's pulse quickened. Helen settled into one of the wooden chairs, her movements careful and deliberate. "Eleanor Whitmore was my dearest friend. We grew up together in the valley below. This cabin—" She looked around with a mixture of love and sadness. This was supposed to be her forever home. Maya poured hot water over tea bags in 2 chipped mugs, her mind racing with questions. What happened to her? The letters stopped suddenly in 1965. Thomas died in Vietnam that summer. Helen's voice carried the weight of old grief. Eleanor was devastated. She'd been living here, waiting for him to come home so they could be married. After the news came, she couldn't bear to stay. She packed up and left for California, said she needed to start over somewhere that didn't hold memories of him. Maya set the tea in front of Helen, processing this information. "She never came back?" "She tried to give me the cabin keys before she left, but I wouldn't take them. I told her this place would always be hers, that maybe someday she'd want to remember the good times instead of just the sorrow." Helen wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "I've been keeping an eye on it ever since, hoping she'd return, but years turned into decades, and—" She shrugged sadly. "Is she still alive?" Maya found herself invested in this story in ways she couldn't fully explain. "I believe so. We exchanged Christmas cards for a while, but that stopped about 10 years ago. Last I heard, she was living in San Diego, had become a teacher, never married, though she could have had her pick of suitors." Helen studied Maya over her tea. "What about you, dear? What brings you to Eleanor's mountain?" Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks. Her own story felt so complicated, so messy compared to the pure love story documented in those letters. "I needed somewhere to think, to figure out what comes next." Helen's knowing smile suggested she understood more than Maya had revealed. "Are you expecting?" Maya's hand moved instinctively to her still flat stomach. "How did you—" "You have that careful way of moving, and you've been drinking tea instead of coffee. Plus, there's something about a woman creating a nest that's unmistakable once you've seen it a few times." Helen's expression was kind. This cabin has always been about new beginnings, even when they came wrapped in endings. The simple acceptance in Helen's voice nearly undid Maya's composure. Here was someone who understood that life rarely followed the neat trajectories people planned, that sometimes the most important chapters began in the most unlikely places. "Would you tell me more about Eleanor and Thomas?" Maya asked quietly. "I feel like their story isn't finished somehow." Helen settled back in her chair, her eyes taking on the distant look of someone preparing to share treasured memories. "Oh, my dear girl, their love story was just the beginning." The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the mountain air crisp and clean. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching steam rise from the wet earth as sunlight filtered through the pine branches. She'd barely slept, her mind churning over the letters she'd discovered. The story of Elena and Thomas felt so real, so immediate, as if their voices still echoed in these rooms. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the gentle flutter of movement within. "What do you think, little one? Are we part of something bigger here?" The baby responded with a soft kick, and Sarah smiled despite the uncertainty gnawing at her. She needed answers, needed to understand how she'd ended up in a place so intimately connected to a love story that seemed to mirror her own heartbreak in reverse. After a simple breakfast of toast and the last of her canned fruit, Sarah decided to explore the property more thoroughly. Yesterday's storm had revealed things previously hidden, a stone pathway partially uncovered by the rushing water, leading from the cabin toward what looked like an old garden plot. Following the stones, she discovered the remnants of what had once been a vegetable garden. Overgrown and wild, but the raised beds were still visible, constructed from carefully stacked river rocks. At the garden's center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk scarred but strong, branches reaching toward the sky like protective arms. Something glinted at the base of the tree. Sarah knelt carefully, brushing away wet leaves and debris. Her fingers found metal, a small tin box, partially buried beneath years of fallen foliage. She lifted it gently, surprised by its weight. Inside the cabin, she set the box on the kitchen table and opened it with trembling hands. The contents made her breath catch. Photographs, dozens of them, showing a young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, often accompanied by a tall man with gentle features. Elena and Thomas, she realized, seeing their faces for the first time. But it was the other items that made her hands shake. A birth certificate for a baby girl named Isabella Rose Martinez, born 3 months premature, a tiny hospital bracelet, a pressed rose, brown with age, and beneath it all, a letter in Elena's familiar handwriting, addressed simply to anyone who finds this. Sarah unfolded the paper carefully, her heart racing. If someone is reading this, then perhaps the universe believes in second chances after all. Isabella lived for only 6 hours, but in those precious moments, she taught us that love doesn't require time to be complete. Thomas and I buried this box beneath our tree on what would have been her first birthday, hoping that someday another family might find happiness in the place where our dreams ended. This cabin was meant to be filled with laughter, with children's voices, with the chaos and joy of family life. We built every room with love, planning for a future that wasn't meant to be ours. But maybe, I hope, it's meant to be yours. The garden was going to be Isabella's playground. The loft was designed as her nursery, with windows positioned to catch the morning light. The wide front porch was for watching her take her first steps, for teaching her to count stars, for all the ordinary moments that make a life extraordinary. We couldn't stay. The memories were too sharp, the silence too loud, but we couldn't bear to sell it either, to let strangers turn our dreams into something else entirely. So we left it waiting for someone who needed sanctuary, waiting for someone brave enough to believe in new beginnings. If you're here, if you're reading this, then perhaps you need the same thing we once did, a place to start over, to heal, to believe in tomorrow again. Please know that whatever brought you here, you're not alone. Love has already lived in these walls. Hope has already taken root in this soil. Take care of our dreams, and maybe they'll take care of yours. With love and endless hope, Elena. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she finished reading. She looked around the cabin with new eyes, seeing not just shelter but sanctuary, not just refuge but inheritance. Elena and Thomas hadn't just left behind their belongings, they'd left behind their hopes, carefully preserved and waiting for someone who needed them. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Sarah laughed through her tears. Did you hear that, sweetheart? We're not squatters or trespassers, we're invited guests. She walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Elena had dreamed of watching her daughter play. The morning light painted everything golden, and for the first time since discovering Marcus's betrayal, Sarah felt something that might have been peace settling in her chest. Maybe she couldn't control what had happened to her. Maybe she couldn't undo the betrayal or erase the pain, but she could choose what happened next. She could choose to believe in the possibility Elena had left behind, that broken things could be mended, that love could grow again in soil watered by tears. The mountain held its secrets close, but this one it had shared willingly. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's grimy windows as Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, Eleanor's journals spread before her like scattered pieces of a puzzle. She'd been reading since dawn, her coffee growing cold as she absorbed the intimate details of a love affair that had unfolded in these very rooms decades ago. June 15th, 1962. Thomas brought wildflowers today, mountain laurel and Indian paintbrush. He said they reminded him of my spirit, wild and beautiful and impossible to tame. I pressed one of each between these pages. If anyone ever finds this, they'll know that love grew here, even in secret. Sarah touched her growing belly absently. wondering what it felt like to be loved so completely that someone would risk everything just to bring you flowers. David had never brought her flowers, not once in their 3 years together. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Through the window she saw Jake's truck parked outside, but he wasn't alone. An older woman with silver hair and kind eyes stood beside him, holding what appeared to be a casserole dish. "Sarah?" Jake's voice carried through the door. "I brought someone I think you should meet." She quickly gathered the journals, tucking them into the wooden chest, before answering. The woman introduced herself as Martha Henderson, Jake's neighbor who lived about 2 miles down the mountain road. "I've been bringing meals to folks in need for 40 years, Martha said, handing Sarah the warm dish. "Jake mentioned you might appreciate some company and a home-cooked meal." As they settled around the small kitchen table, Martha's eyes wandered the cabin with obvious recognition. "Haven't been inside this place since—" She paused, her expression growing distant. "Well, since Eleanor was here." Sarah's fork stopped midway to her mouth. "You knew Eleanor?" "Knew her?" Martha laughed softly. "Honey, Eleanor was my best friend. This cabin was our secret meeting place for years." Her eyes grew misty. "I was probably the only person in town who knew about her and Thomas." Jake leaned forward, clearly as intrigued as Sarah. "Thomas?" Martha nodded slowly. "Thomas Mitchell. He was married to Eleanor's cousin, Ruth. The whole situation was—" She shook her head. "Complicated doesn't even begin to describe it." Sarah felt her heart racing. "What happened to them?" "Eleanor came here pregnant," Martha said quietly. "Summer of 1962. She'd been living in the city, working as a secretary, but when she found out about the baby—" Martha's voice trailed off. "Thomas was going to leave Ruth. He'd already told me he couldn't live the lie anymore. But then Ruth found out about Eleanor." The older woman stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountain view. "Ruth threatened to tell the whole town, ruin Thomas's business, destroy Eleanor's reputation. This was 1962, remember? Things like this could destroy a person's entire life." "So what did they do?" Sarah whispered. "Eleanor disappeared one night, left everything behind except a letter for Thomas." Martha turned back to them. She wrote that she couldn't let him sacrifice everything for her and the baby, that she'd rather love him from a distance than watch his world crumble. Sarah thought of the wedding dress in the chest, the careful way it had been preserved. They were going to get married. Oh yes, Thomas had bought her a ring and everything. After she left, he came here every day for months, hoping she'd return. Eventually, he moved away too. Ruth got the house, the business, everything. "Did they ever see each other again?" Jake asked. Martha's smile was bittersweet. "That's the beautiful part. 20 years later, after Ruth had passed away and their daughter was grown, Eleanor came back. She'd raised her daughter alone, worked her way up to running her own business. She was stronger, more independent than ever. And Thomas? He'd never remarried, never stopped loving her. When Eleanor returned to claim this cabin, turned out her grandfather had left it to her in his will. Thomas was the first person she called." Martha's eyes sparkled. "They had 15 wonderful years together before Eleanor passed. 15 years of the life they should have had from the beginning." Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks. They got their happy ending. They did, and Eleanor always said this cabin was blessed because of it. She believed it would bring hope to anyone who needed it most. Martha reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. "Maybe that's why you're here." As Martha and Jake prepared to leave, the older woman pulled something from her purse, a small faded photograph. "I thought you might want to see them." The photo showed a couple standing in front of the cabin. Eleanor, older than in the pictures Sarah had found, her hair silver but her smile radiant. Beside her stood a tall man with gentle eyes, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. "Love finds a way," Martha said softly. "Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it takes starting over completely, but real love always finds a way." That night, alone again in the cabin, Sarah placed the photograph on the mantel next to Eleanor's journals, feeling less alone than she had in months. The morning light filtered through the cabin's dusty windows as Sarah carefully arranged the photographs she'd found in chronological order across the kitchen table. Each image told a piece of Eleanor and Thomas's story, young love blooming into something deeper, more complex than she'd initially understood. Her fingers traced the edge of a photo showing Eleanor in a wedding dress, but not the white gown from the earlier pictures. This dress was simple, cream-colored, and Eleanor looked older, more weathered. Thomas stood beside her, his hair silver at the temples, wearing a quiet smile that spoke of hard-won happiness, a second wedding, a second chance. Sarah's breath caught as she noticed the date penciled on the back, 1987, the same year as the final entry in Eleanor's journal, the one where she'd written about forgiveness and new beginnings. Whatever had driven them apart hadn't been the end of their story. A knock at the cabin door startled her from her thoughts. Through the window, she saw Ben's familiar figure on the porch, holding what appeared to be a manila envelope. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said when she opened the door, "but I think I found something you should see." Sarah stepped aside to let him in, suddenly aware of how intimate the cabin had become, her makeshift home filled with another woman's memories, her own story somehow intertwining with Eleanor's in ways she was only beginning to understand. Ben's eyes swept over the photographs spread across the table, his expression thoughtful. "You've been busy. I found their whole story," Sarah said, settling back into her chair, "or at least more of it than I expected." He sat across from her, the envelope between his hands. "That's actually why I'm here. After our conversation yesterday, I couldn't stop thinking about what you'd discovered. I went through my grandmother's papers again, more carefully this time." Sarah watched as he opened the envelope and withdrew a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Her heart quickened. She recognized Eleanor's handwriting on the top envelope. "My grandmother kept these," Ben said quietly. "I never read them before. I thought they were just old correspondence, but the names... Eleanor and Thomas Mitchell." "Mitchell," Sarah repeated, the surname clicking into place. The cabin deed, it was in Eleanor Mitchell's name. Ben nodded, then carefully untied the ribbon. "These letters span about 15 years, from 1972 to 1987. Would you like me to read some of them?" Sarah found herself nodding, drawn into the mystery despite the strange intimacy of listening to a stranger read love letters in the cabin where they'd been written. Ben's voice was gentle as he began with the first letter, dated 1972. "My dearest Eleanor, I know you said you needed time to think, but 3 months feels like 3 years. The house is too quiet without your laughter, and I find myself saving up stories to tell you, forgetting that you're not here to listen." The letter went on, Thomas's words painting a picture of a man desperately trying to understand where his marriage had gone wrong. He wrote of lonely dinners and sleepless nights, of wanting to fix whatever had broken between them but not knowing how. "There's a gap here," Ben said, shuffling through the letters. "The next one is from 1975. This letter was different, less desperate, more mature. Thomas wrote about starting therapy, about learning to understand his own role in their problems. He mentioned anger management and a growing awareness of how his work stress had poisoned their home life. As Ben continued reading, Sarah felt her own chest tighten. The parallels to her own situation were uncomfortably clear. A marriage destroyed by betrayal and hurt, the long journey toward healing, the question of whether love could survive such fundamental damage. "Here's one from 1983, Ben said, his voice softer now. "Eleanor, I saw you at the farmer's market today. You looked so beautiful in that blue dress, the one you wore on our anniversary 3 years ago. I wanted to approach you, but I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me. I know I have no right to ask, but would you be willing to have coffee? Just to talk. I've learned so much about myself these past years, and I hope, I've become the man you deserved all along." Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her belly, where the baby stirred gently. "Did she say yes?" Ben smiled, reaching for another letter. "Eventually. This one's from 1985. Thomas, yesterday was wonderful. I'd forgotten how easily we could talk, how safe I felt with you. I'm not ready to rush into anything, but I think I'd like to try again. slowly this time, carefully. The afternoon sun slanted lower through the windows as they read letter after letter, watching Eleanor and Thomas rebuild their relationship from the ground up. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. Their correspondence revealed months of counseling, careful boundaries, and honest conversations about trust and forgiveness. But it was real, it was lasting, and it gave Sarah something she hadn't dared hope for, proof that sometimes broken things could be mended into something even stronger than before. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline morning that made the world look newly minted. Elena stood at the window, watching sunlight dance across the snow-covered meadow, when she heard the sound of an engine struggling up the mountain road. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the familiar rumble of David's truck. She'd been expecting this moment for weeks, yet she still wasn't prepared. Through the frost-etched glass, she watched him park and sit motionless in the cab for several minutes, as if gathering courage. When he finally stepped out, she was struck by how different he looked, thinner, older somehow, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Elena moved away from the window, her hand instinctively protective over her belly. The baby had been more active lately, as if sensing her emotional turbulence. She'd rehearsed this conversation countless times, but now that David was actually here, all her carefully chosen words evaporated. His knock was tentative, almost apologetic. She opened the door but didn't step aside to let him in. "Elena." His voice was rough with emotion. "You look pregnant?" The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "Beautiful," he finished quietly. "You look beautiful." Despite everything, despite the betrayal that had driven her to this mountain refuge, something inside her still responded to his voice. She hated herself for it. "What do you want, David?" "To talk, to explain, to—" He gestured helplessly. "I've been looking for you for months. When the first finally tracked you here, I couldn't believe you were living in this place. This place has been more of a home to me than anywhere else." The words surprised her with their truth. What happened to explanations mattering? "You had plenty of chances before I left." "I was a coward." He shoved his hands deep in his pockets, shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. "When Sarah told me she was pregnant, when she said she'd destroy everything if I didn't—" "Don't." Elena's voice cut through his excuse like a blade. "Don't you dare blame her for your choices." "You're right." He looked down at his boots. "I made the choice. I chose what seemed easier, what seemed safer for everyone involved. I was wrong." Elena felt tears threatening and fought them back. She'd cried enough tears over David Morrison to fill the valley below. "And now? Now that Sarah's had the baby? Now that your perfect life isn't so perfect anymore?" His wince told her she'd hit the mark. "Sarah and we're getting divorced. The baby isn't even—" He stopped himself. "Isn't even yours," Elena finished. "Oh my God, David, do you hear yourself? Do you have any idea what you threw away, what you put me through?" The baby kicked hard, as if responding to her elevated emotions. Elena pressed her hand to her side, breathing deeply the way Margaret's letters had taught her to do. In the weeks since discovering the hidden correspondence, she'd found herself drawing strength from the other woman's wisdom, her grace in the face of loss. "Whose baby is it?" David asked quietly, his eyes fixed on her hand. For a moment, Elena was tempted to lie, to tell him it belonged to someone else. It would be so much simpler, so much cleaner. But Margaret's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, "Truth is the only foundation worth building on, even when it's painful." "Yours," she said simply. The word hit him like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face cycling through shock, joy, and anguish. "Mine? But how? When?" "That last night, before everything fell apart. Before you chose her over us." Elena's voice remained steady, though her heart was fracturing all over again. "Before you decided that your reputation mattered more than our future." David's eyes filled with tears. "Elena, I'm not telling you this because I want something from you," she interrupted. "I'm telling you because this child deserves to know the truth about their father, even if that truth is complicated." "What are you saying?" Elena looked out at the mountains that had sheltered her, at the meadow where she'd learned to find peace again. "I'm saying that I don't need you anymore, David. I don't need your money or your promises or your guilt. This baby and we're going to be fine. But I could." "You could what? Suddenly become the man I thought you were? Turn back time and make different choices?" She shook her head. "Some things can't be fixed with good intentions and regret." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of all their might-have-beens. Finally David spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Could I at least know when the baby's born?" Elena studied his face, seeing the genuine pain there, the desperate hope. Margaret had forgiven Thomas despite his flaws, had found a way to love that transcended perfect circumstances. "Maybe," she said finally, "but not because you have a right to know, because someday this child might want to know you." The photograph trembled in Maya's hands as she stared at the familiar face looking back at her. Her grandmother, Eleanor, stood beside a tall man with kind eyes and weathered hands, the same hands that had carved the intricate wooden animals scattered throughout the cabin, the same hands that had written those tender love letters she'd been reading for weeks. "This can't be right," she whispered to the empty room, but even as she spoke the words, pieces began clicking into place with devastating clarity. The way Eleanor had always spoken of this mountain with such longing, the mysterious trips she'd taken every summer, claiming she needed solitude to write, the distant look that would cross her face whenever anyone mentioned second chances. Maya sank into the rocking chair, her growing belly making the movement awkward. Behind the photograph she discovered more, dozens of them spanning what looked like 30 years. Eleanor and Thomas at different ages, in different seasons, but always here, always together, always radiating the same quiet contentment Maya had glimpsed in fragments throughout the cabin. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and rain began pattering against the windows. Maya barely noticed. She was too busy reconstructing everything she thought she knew about her grandmother's life. Eleanor had been married to Maya's grandfather until his death when Maya was 12. She'd played the role of the devoted widow perfectly, keeping his memory alive, never seeming to look at another man. But these photographs told a different story entirely. They showed a woman who had found love again, who had kept it secret, who had built an entire second life in this remote cabin. A loose floorboard creaked behind her, and Maya turned to see a small wooden box she hadn't noticed before, partially hidden beneath a fallen quilt. Inside, she found Eleanor's journal, not the published poetry collections Maya knew, but something far more personal. June 15th, 1998. "Thomas thinks I should tell the family about us. He doesn't understand how they'd react, how they'd judge me for loving someone so soon after William's death. But what they don't know is that Thomas and I met years before William died, and the guilt of loving them both nearly destroyed me. When William passed, I thought I'd lost my chance at happiness with Thomas too. Finding him again feels like a miracle I don't deserve." Maya's hand moved instinctively to her belly. She understood that guilt, that sense of not deserving happiness. She'd been carrying it since the moment she'd discovered Marcus's betrayal, wondering if somehow she'd brought it on herself. August 3rd, 2001. I brought the baby blanket I knitted for Maya up here. Thomas found me crying over it today, and I finally told him about the granddaughter I barely know, how my secrets have built walls between me and everyone I love. He held me while I sobbed and said something I'll never forget. "Love isn't meant to be hoarded, Eleanor. It grows when it's shared. But how do I share a love I've hidden for so long?" The baby blanket. Maya looked around the room with new eyes and spotted it draped over the back of a chair near the fireplace. Soft yellow wool with tiny white flowers. Eleanor had made it for her, had brought it here to this secret sanctuary. As she continued reading, Maya watched her grandmother struggle with the same demons that had been plaguing her. The fear of judgment, the weight of secrets, the overwhelming loneliness that came from believing she had to face everything alone. December 20th, 2005. Thomas proposed again today. I said no again, but my heart screamed yes. I've become so good at protecting myself that I've forgotten how to live. He deserves better than a woman who loves him in shadows. June 10th, 2010. We planted a garden together this year. Tomatoes and herbs and wildflowers. Thomas said it doesn't matter that I can't give him a traditional life, this is enough. Watching him tend to those plants with such gentle care, I finally understood what he's been trying to tell me. Love doesn't require other people's permission to exist. The final entry was dated just 2 months before Eleanor's death. October 18th, 2015. I'm running out of time, and there's so much I never said. Maya called today, and I wanted so desperately to tell her about Thomas, about this place, about love that survives even when we think we don't deserve it. Instead, I listened to her talk about Marcus and heard the same fear in her voice that's ruled my life for decades. I should have been braver. I should have shown her that it's possible to start over. Lightning illuminated the cabin, and Maya realized she was crying. Eleanor had lived a parallel life here, finding love and losing it to her own fears, just as Maya had been doing. The old woman had left these belongings not as mere memories, but as breadcrumbs leading toward a different kind of existence. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, Maya felt something shifting. The loneliness that had consumed her for months was beginning to crack, letting in possibilities she hadn't dared imagine. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke as Elena finished reading the last letter in the wooden box. Rain hammered against the cabin's windows with such force that she wondered if the glass might shatter. Lightning illuminated the small room in stark, momentary brightness, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of the old structure. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements. Even in the womb, her child seemed to sense the electricity in the air, both from the storm outside and the revelations that had just turned Elena's understanding of her past upside down. Margaret Chen. Her grandmother's name had been scattered throughout those letters, like breadcrumbs, leading to a truth Elena had never imagined. The love story she'd been piecing together wasn't just any romance. It was her own family's hidden history. Her grandmother Margaret had been here, in this very cabin, carrying Elena's father as an unmarried woman in 1962. The shame and secrecy that had driven Margaret to this remote hideaway suddenly made sense. In an era when pregnancy outside marriage could destroy a woman's reputation and future, Margaret had chosen exile over judgment. But she hadn't been alone. Thomas, the man whose handwriting Elena had come to recognize, whose words of love and devotion filled page after page, had found her here. He'd brought supplies, comfort, and promises of a future together that circumstances seemed determined to deny them. Elena stood carefully, her joints stiff from sitting on the floor for hours, and walked to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could barely make out the outline of the old oak tree where she'd discovered the first buried letter weeks ago. How many secrets had this place held? How many women had found refuge here when the world turned against them? The baby kicked hard against her ribs, and Elena winced. "I know, little one," she whispered. "It's a lot to take in." A sudden knock at the door made her heart leap into her throat. Through the storm's chaos, she'd heard footsteps on the porch. Elena approached the door cautiously, one hand on her belly. "Elena, it's David. Please, I need to talk to you." Her ex-husband's voice, barely audible above the wind and rain, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the weather. Elena's hand hovered over the door handle. She hadn't heard from David since that devastating day when she'd discovered his affair and found herself both betrayed and homeless. "Go away, David," she called through the door. "There's nothing left to say." "There's everything to say. I know about the baby. I know I destroyed everything, but please, just let me explain." Elena closed her eyes. The baby was his, though she'd hoped never to have to navigate that complicated reality. She'd planned to figure out custody and support arrangements later, through lawyers, keeping emotional distance between them. "How did you find me?" "Your friend Sarah. She said you needed space, but when the storm hit, she was worried about you being alone up here. Elena silently cursed Sarah's well-meaning interference, though part of her recognized the genuine care behind it. The storm was severe, and cell phone reception was non-existent this high in the mountains. Another flash of lightning revealed David's silhouette through the window, soaked, shivering, and looking more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. Despite everything he'd done to her, she couldn't leave anyone standing in a storm like this. She opened the door, and David stumbled inside, water streaming from his clothes onto the worn wooden floors. His eyes immediately went to her rounded belly, and something crumpled in his expression. God, Elena, I've been such a fool. Yes, you have. Her voice was steady, but her heart was racing. But that doesn't change anything, David. You made your choice when you decided our marriage wasn't enough for you. He stood there dripping, looking around the cabin with confusion and something that might have been admiration. You've been living here? Alone? I've been healing here, she corrected, learning things about myself, about our family that I never knew before. David's gaze fell on the scattered letters and photographs spread across the floor near the wooden box. What is all this? Elena felt a protective instinct rise in her chest. These weren't just documents and mementos, they were sacred pieces of her grandmother's story, of a love that had endured despite impossible circumstances. They represented hope and resilience, and the kind of devotion David had proven incapable of maintaining. They're none of your concern, she said firmly, just like I'm none of your concern anymore. Outside, the storm raged on, trapping them together in the small space where Elena had begun to rebuild her life from the ashes of their marriage. The irony wasn't lost on her. In the same place where her grandmother had once faced an uncertain future while carrying Elena's father, Elena now confronted her own crossroads with David's child growing inside her. The baby kicked again, as if reminding her that whatever happened next, she wasn't facing it alone. She had her grandmother's strength, this sanctuary's peace, and the growing certainty that some storms, no matter how fierce, eventually pass. The morning light filtered through the cabin windows differently now, carrying with it the weight of secrets finally shared. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea, watching Daniel move about the space with familiar ease. Every gesture, every glance toward the photographs on the mantel now made perfect sense. She kept everything, he said softly, running his fingers along the spine of one of Margaret's journals. Even after I stopped writing. Clara's heart ached for the pain in his voice. Tell me about the letters you didn't send. Daniel settled across from her, his weathered hands folding together. After Sarah died, I couldn't find the words. What do you say to someone when you've failed at the one thing that mattered most? Margaret had trusted me with her daughter's heart, and I couldn't protect her. You couldn't have prevented the cancer. But I could have been stronger, could have been the husband Sarah deserved in those final months instead of falling apart. His voice cracked. Margaret tried to reach out after the funeral, called, wrote letters. I was too ashamed to respond. Clara leaned forward, understanding flooding through her. So you came here instead. This was our place, Sarah and mine. We talked about buying it someday, fixing it up. He gestured around the cabin. After she died, I found out Margaret had purchased it, left it to me in her will with a letter saying Sarah would have wanted me to find peace here. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The men's clothing in the closet, the way certain items seemed arranged with care rather than abandoned. Margaret hadn't just owned this cabin, she'd prepared it for Daniel's return. You've been living here. On and off for 3 years. I'd come for weeks at a time, trying to make sense of everything. Reading Margaret's journals, looking through Sarah's things that Margaret saved. He paused. Then you showed up that night in the storm. Clara remembered his startled expression when he'd first seen her, the way he'd seemed to recognize something. You thought I was... For a moment in the darkness, you looked so much like Sarah. Same height, same way of holding yourself. He shook his head. I know it sounds crazy. It didn't sound crazy at all. Clara touched her belly, feeling the baby's gentle movement. Maybe it wasn't crazy. Maybe it was exactly what we both needed. They sat in comfortable silence, the cabin holding them in its embrace of memories and possibilities. Clara thought about the journal entries she'd read, Margaret's words about love persisting beyond death, about the way broken people could heal each other if they were brave enough to try. "Daniel," she said carefully, "what happened with your family? Your children?" His expression darkened. "They blamed me for their mother's death. Said I gave up, that I wasn't there when she needed me most. They weren't wrong." He stared out the window toward the mountains. "My son, Michael, he told me I was dead to them. That was 2 years ago." Clara felt a familiar ache of abandonment, but this time it was for someone else's pain. People say things when they're grieving, things they don't always mean, maybe. But some words can't be taken back. She thought about her own situation, about the family that had turned their backs on her when she needed them most. Or maybe they can. Maybe it just takes time and the right kind of courage. Daniel looked at her with something approaching hope. "You really believe that?" "I have to. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this?" She gestured between them, around the cabin, toward the life growing inside her. Margaret believed it. That's what all those journals were about, believing that love finds a way, even when everything seems broken. As if summoned by their conversation, Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. "I found this yesterday, tucked inside one of her books. It's addressed to both of us." Clara's breath caught. "Both of us?" "To Daniel and the woman who will help him heal," he read from the envelope's careful script. With trembling fingers, Clara watched as he opened the letter. Margaret's familiar handwriting filled the page, but these words were different from her journal entries, more purposeful, more prophetic. "If you're reading this together," Daniel read aloud, "then Sarah's spirit has worked the magic I always knew it would. Love doesn't end with death, my dear ones. It transforms, guides, and creates new possibilities. Take care of each other. Take care of the family you're about to build." Clara's hand flew to her belly as tears spilled down her cheeks. Somehow, Margaret had known, had seen something neither of them could have imagined when grief and betrayal had brought them to this remote place. Daniel reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "Clara, I think we've been given something precious here, a chance to honor their memory by building something beautiful from our broken pieces." Outside, snow began to fall gently, blessing the cabin and its occupants with the promise of new beginnings. The box trembled in Sarah's hands as she lifted the final layer of tissue paper. Beneath lay a birth certificate, the edges worn soft with handling, and a bundle of letters tied with the same faded blue ribbon she'd seen throughout Eleanor's belongings. But it was the photograph, tucked between the documents, that made her breath catch. A young woman with dark hair and familiar eyes, cradling a newborn baby. The woman in the photograph was Eleanor, decades younger, but unmistakably her, and written on the back in Eleanor's careful script, "My precious David, 3 days old. May you find your way home to me someday." Sarah's legs gave way, and she sank onto the cabin floor, the photograph fluttering from her numb fingers. David, the same David who had betrayed her, who had left her homeless and pregnant, who had shattered every dream she'd built for their future together. The man she'd thought she knew completely had never mentioned being adopted, never spoken of searching for his birth mother, never breathed a word about the mountain cabin that had become her salvation. The birth certificate confirmed what the photograph whispered. David Michael Harrison, born to Eleanor Rose Harrison, father unknown. The address listed was this very cabin, 32 years ago. Sarah pressed her palm against her rounded belly, feeling the baby's restless movements as if sensing her turmoil. With shaking hands, she reached for the letters, untying the ribbon that had preserved them all these years. The first was addressed to the county adoption agency, dated just weeks after David's birth. Eleanor's words, written in the same careful script Sarah had come to recognize, pleaded for information about her son's placement, begged for assurance that he was loved and cared for, promised that she would never stop hoping for reunion. The letters that followed chronicled a mother's unwavering devotion across decades, birthday wishes sent into the void, Christmas greetings addressed to no one and everyone, updates about her life in the mountains, her work as a teacher, her garden, her endless hope that someday her son would find his way back to her. The final letter, dated just 6 months ago, spoke of her declining health and her decision to leave the cabin exactly as it was, a lighthouse for the son who might someday come looking for his history. Sarah wiped tears from her cheeks, her heart breaking for Eleanor's lonely vigil and for David, who had never known about the mother who loved him so completely. But beneath the sorrow, anger began to simmer. He had known. Somehow he had to have known about this place, about Eleanor. How else would the key to the cabin have been hidden in their shared apartment, tucked away in the drawer where he kept his important papers? The sound of an engine outside made her freeze. Through the window, she watched a familiar truck pull up the winding drive, David's silhouette unmistakable behind the wheel. Her first instinct was to hide, to pretend she wasn't there, but there was nowhere to go. The cabin that had sheltered her was about to become a battlefield. David's footsteps on the porch were hesitant, uncertain. When he knocked, it was soft, almost apologetic. "Sarah? I know you're in there. I saw the smoke from the chimney." She didn't answer, couldn't find words that felt adequate for this moment. The knocking came again, more insistent. "Please, Sarah. I can explain everything. About the cabin, about Eleanor, about why I never told you. I know how this must look, but it's not what you think. Isn't it?" Her voice cracked as she finally spoke. "Because what I think is that you've been lying to me about everything. What I think is that you knew exactly where I was, and you let me believe I was alone." The door handle turned slowly, and David stepped inside, his face haggard and drawn. His eyes immediately found the scattered documents, the photographs, the evidence of Eleanor's long vigil spread across the floor like accusations. "She was my birth mother," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I only found out 6 months ago, after she died. The lawyer handling her estate tracked me down, told me about the cabin, about everything she'd left behind. And you never thought to mention this? Not even when I was desperate, when I had nowhere else to go?" David's shoulders sagged. "I couldn't. I was ashamed. Here was this woman who spent her whole life loving me, hoping for me, and I never even knew she existed. I came here once right after the funeral and I couldn't handle it. All that love, all that loss. I left the key at your place because I couldn't bear to keep it." Sarah struggled to her feet, her hand pressed against the wall for support. "So I was what? Your proxy? Your way of dealing with guilt you couldn't face yourself?" "No." David stepped toward her, his eyes desperate. "Sarah, I never meant for any of this to happen." The morning light filtered through the cabin windows as Sarah carefully placed the last of Eleanor's letters back into the wooden box. Her hands trembled slightly as she closed the lid, the weight of the revelations settling deep in her chest. The baby stirred within her, and she pressed a palm to her belly, wondering what kind of world she was bringing this child into, one of secrets and half-truths, or one where love could overcome the deepest wounds. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window she could see Marcus standing on the porch, his shoulders hunched against the morning chill. She hesitated, remembering Eleanor's words about forgiveness being a gift you give yourself. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," Marcus said quietly, his eyes searching her face. Dark circles shadowed his features, and his usually pressed clothes were wrinkled, as if he'd slept in them. "I almost didn't," Sarah admitted, stepping aside to let him in. "But I've been reading some letters that made me think about second chances." Marcus glanced around the cabin, taking in the photographs now displayed on the mantel, the journals stacked neatly on the table. "You've learned about Eleanor and Henry, more than I ever expected to." Sarah moved to the kitchen, needing something to do with her hands. "Coffee? Please." He sat heavily at the small table, his fingers drumming nervously on the worn wood. "Sarah, I need you to know that keeping this from you wasn't about not trusting you. It was about protecting something sacred." She poured 2 cups, the familiar ritual helping to calm her racing heart. "Eleanor was your grandmother. She raised me after my parents died. This cabin, this land, it was her sanctuary. When she got sick, she made me promise to keep it exactly as it was, to preserve what she and Henry had built together. His voice cracked slightly. I never expected someone like you to stumble into it and understand it the way you have. Sarah set his cup in front of him, their fingers brushing briefly. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through her. Someone like me? Someone who needed healing as much as this place did. Marcus looked up at her, his eyes intense. Eleanor used to say that the cabin would know when the right person came along, that it would call to someone who understood what real love looked like, even if they'd never experienced it themselves. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Sarah thought about David's betrayal, how it had shattered her faith in love entirely, but here, surrounded by the tangible evidence of Eleanor and Henry's devotion, she felt something shifting inside her chest. I read about the miscarriages, she said softly, how they tried for years to have children. Marcus nodded. It nearly broke them apart. Eleanor blamed herself, Henry blamed the world, but they found their way back to each other. They had to learn that love doesn't always look the way you expect it to. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her belly. I'm scared, Marcus. I'm scared I don't know how to be a mother, how to give this baby what it needs. I'm scared I'm too broken to create something whole. Hey, Marcus stood, crossing to where she leaned against the counter. You're not broken. Wounded maybe, but not broken. There's a difference. She looked up at him, seeing something in his expression that made her breath catch. What are we doing here, Marcus? This whole situation, me living in your family's cabin, you helping me rebuild my life, it's complicated. The best things usually are. His hand lifted, hovering near her cheek before he let it fall. I told myself I was just honoring Eleanor's wishes, protecting what she loved. But the truth is, watching you bring this place back to life, seeing you find strength you didn't know you had, it's changed something in me too. The baby kicked suddenly, making Sarah gasp. Without thinking, Marcus's hand moved to cover hers on her belly, his eyes widening as he felt the movement beneath their joined palms. That's incredible, he whispered. She's been active lately. I think she knows things are changing. Sarah's voice was barely audible, the intimacy of the moment overwhelming. She? Just a feeling I have. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in weeks. Eleanor mentioned in one of her letters that women know things, that we feel the truth in our bones. Marcus's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. What does your intuition tell you about us? The question hung in the air like morning mist, delicate and full of possibility. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his touch, the steady presence of him beside her. For the first time since David's betrayal, she allowed herself to imagine trusting someone again. It tells me, she said slowly, opening her eyes to meet his gaze, that maybe Eleanor was right about second chances. The morning light filtered through the cabin windows differently now, warmer somehow, as if the secrets that had been trapped within these walls for decades had finally found their way to freedom. Sarah stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, watching Marcus load the last of Eleanor's letters into a wooden box. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice gentle but concerned. Once we drive down to town and share Eleanor's story, there's no taking it back. Sarah's free hand rested on her rounded belly, where the baby had been unusually active all morning, as if sensing the magnitude of the day ahead. She waited 60 years for someone to tell her story. I won't let her wait any longer. The drive to Cedar Falls felt different from all the times Sarah had made this journey over the past months. No longer was she the desperate, broken woman fleeing from betrayal. The person sitting beside Marcus now had purpose, had discovered something worth fighting for beyond her own survival. They pulled up in front of the Cedar Falls Historical Society, a modest brick building that Sarah had passed countless times, but never entered. Mrs. Henderson, the society's president, had agreed to meet them after Marcus called the night before, mentioning Eleanor Morrison's name. I remember the stories about her, Mrs. Henderson said as she unlocked the front door. She was a woman in her 70s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. My grandmother used to talk about the Morrison girl who vanished, said it was the greatest tragedy this town ever saw. Inside the small museum, surrounded by faded photographs and local memorabilia, Sarah carefully removed Eleanor's letters from the box. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened as Sarah began to read passages aloud. Eleanor's words about her pregnancy, her exile, her years of solitude in the mountain cabin. "Oh my God," Mrs. Henderson whispered. "She was alive all this time?" "Until 3 months ago," Sarah said softly. "She left these letters and a journal. She wanted her story told." As Sarah continued reading, Mrs. Henderson pulled out a thick photo album. She flipped through yellowed pages until she found what she was looking for, a newspaper clipping from 1963. The headline read, "Local girl missing, search continues." Below it was a photograph that made Sarah's breath catch. A young woman with dark hair and bright eyes stared back at her, wearing a simple dress and a hesitant smile. Eleanor Morrison, 18 years old, her whole life ahead of her. "She was beautiful," Marcus said quietly. "She was brave," Sarah corrected, thinking of Eleanor's final letter, the one that had taken her weeks to finish reading. In it, Eleanor had written about watching the seasons change from her cabin window, about raising chickens and tending a garden, about finding peace in solitude, even as her heart never stopped aching for the family that had cast her out. Mrs. Henderson was crying now, tears falling onto the glass that protected the old newspaper. Her parents died, never knowing what happened to her. They searched for months. "She knew," Sarah said. She wrote about watching her father's search parties from the ridge above the cabin. She wanted to call out to them, but she was afraid. Afraid of the shame, afraid of making things worse. They spent the next hour going through Eleanor's belongings. Mrs. Henderson examined each item with reverence. The pressed flowers Eleanor had collected, the sketches she'd made of wildlife around the cabin, the recipe cards written in her careful handwriting. "The town needs to know about this," Mrs. Henderson finally said. "Eleanor Morrison deserves to be remembered properly, not as a missing girl, but as a woman who survived, who lived on her own terms despite everything." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson pulled Sarah aside. "What made you stay in that cabin? Most people would have been frightened, finding someone else's belongings like that." Sarah considered the question, her hand finding her belly again. "I think maybe I needed her story as much as she needed someone to tell it. When I found those letters, I was ready to give up on everything. Love, trust, the possibility of happiness. Eleanor showed me that survival isn't enough. She found a way to live with dignity, even in isolation. She never let bitterness consume her." Walking back to Marcus's truck, Sarah felt a sense of completion settling over her. Eleanor's story would be preserved now, shared with the community that had mourned her disappearance for 6 decades. "What happens next?" Marcus asked as they drove back toward the mountain. Sarah watched the familiar landscape roll by, the creek that bubbled alongside the road, the pine trees that grew thicker as they climbed higher, the rocky outcroppings that had become as familiar as old friends. Soon she would have to make decisions about the future, about where to raise her child, about what came after this strange and transformative chapter of her life. But for now, she had given Eleanor Morrison her voice back. Everything else could wait until tomorrow. The morning light filtered through the cabin windows with a golden warmth that seemed to embrace everything it touched. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, carefully arranging the letters she'd found into chronological order, her fingers tracing the familiar handwriting that had become like a compass guiding her toward understanding. Beside her, Thomas dozed peacefully in his carrier, his tiny fist curled against his cheek. The sound of footsteps on the porch made her look up. Through the window, she saw Marcus approaching with 2 steaming cups of coffee, his face carrying the same mixture of nervousness and hope that had defined these past few weeks since they'd begun talking again. "I brought peace offerings," he said as she opened the door, offering one of the cups. "And maybe some answers, if you're ready for them." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, breathing in its rich aroma. "I found something yesterday. In the attic." She gestured toward the letters spread across the table. "They're from Eleanor to a woman named Catherine. Love letters spanning 40 years. Marcus set down his cup and leaned over the table, his eyes widening as he recognized the careful script. "My grandmother's handwriting. But who was Catherine?" "Your grandmother's first love," Sarah said softly. "The one she thought she'd lost forever." She picked up one of the later letters, dated just 3 years ago. "Listen to this. My dearest Catherine, after all these years of thinking you were gone, finding your letters in the old mailbox has given me hope that perhaps it's never too late for new beginnings. I know I made choices that hurt us both, choices made from fear rather than faith." Marcus sank into the chair across from her, his face pale. "She never told me about any of this." "There's more." Sarah unfolded a letter she'd read several times, the words etched in her memory. "Eleanor writes about how she was pregnant once, before she married your grandfather. She gave birth to a daughter and gave her up for adoption because her family threatened to disown her. She spent her whole life wondering what became of that child." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Marcus reached for the letter with trembling hands, reading the passage Sarah had quoted. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Catherine was the daughter she gave up," he whispered. "They found each other through one of those online genealogy sites. Catherine had been searching for her birth mother for decades." Sarah's voice grew soft with wonder. "They corresponded for 3 years before Eleanor died. She was planning to change her will, to leave the cabin to Catherine. That's why she made you promise to keep it in the family." Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "All this time, I thought she was just being sentimental about this old place. I never understood why it mattered so much to her. Because it was supposed to be Catherine's inheritance, her way of making amends." Sarah joined him at the window, Thomas stirring slightly in his carrier. "But Eleanor died before she could change the legal documents. You inherited it instead, never knowing you had a cousin out there waiting. Do we know if Catherine is still alive, where she is?" Sarah nodded toward a small stack of envelopes on the counter. "I found Catherine's return address. She lives about 2 hours north of here, in a little town called Pine Ridge. The last letter is from 6 months ago. She was still writing to Eleanor, not knowing she'd passed away." Marcus turned to face her, his expression a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "I have to find her. I have to tell her about the cabin, about Eleanor's wishes." "We should find her," Sarah corrected gently. "This story brought us back together, Marcus. Maybe it's meant to bring your family together too." He studied her face, searching for something. "Does this mean you're willing to give us another chance? To trust that I've learned from my mistakes?" Sarah looked around the cabin that had sheltered her when she had nowhere else to go, at the letters that spoke of love persisting despite decades of separation, at her son who deserved to grow up believing in the possibility of redemption. Eleanor wrote something in her last letter to Catherine that keeps echoing in my mind. She said, "Love is not about perfect timing or perfect people. It's about perfect forgiveness and the courage to begin again." Marcus stepped closer, hope dawning in his eyes. "Are you saying yes?" "I'm saying I want to try. For us, for Thomas, for the family we could be." She reached for his hand. "But first we find Catherine. We make this right." Through the window, the mountains stretched endlessly toward the horizon, their peaks touched with snow that caught the morning light like promises waiting to be kept. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily on the thermal currents, riding the wind toward home.